Welcome to the Global Discussion, discussions with creatives, leaders, and thinkers. My name is Simon Hodgkins, and I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Chloe Carmichael. You're very welcome to the podcast, Dr. Chloe. Let's begin by asking you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your journey and all the wide and wonderful areas that you're involved in. So over to you.
Sure, thanks. I'm a clinical psychologist, which means I have a PhD in clinical psychology. I'm a business owner, so I employ multiple people and I really enjoy the business side of what I do as well. I'm also a USA Today bestselling author, so have to plug my books, Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety, as well as Dr. Chloe's 10 Commandments of Dating. So seem like kind of two different books, but they really both touch on what I enjoy, which is working with high functioning people. And I was a yoga teacher. And on a personal note, I'm a wife and mother.
Well, that's a wonderful introduction. And you mentioned the book there as well. So I do want to talk about the book. Maybe we go there first because it's not many people that have Deepak Chopra endorsing their book or giving them a nice quote for their book. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about your books and tell us a little bit about, what it was like to write those books and how they've gone for you and what they mean to you?
Sure. So thanks for mentioning the Deepak quote. That was honestly kind of a stunner for me too. I've always admired Deepak Chopra because, like I said, I was a yoga teacher before I was a clinical psychologist. And I think the reason that he did endorse my book, Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety, is because that book has a little bit of a focus on mindfulness. And I always kind of feel like people misunderstand what mindfulness is. Like they think it's about just taking a deep breath and being in the moment or something, which is okay. But as a clinical psychologist, I really like to describe it as metacognition, which is being able to think about your thoughts and see them on a 30,000-foot level and have almost more of like a control view of your thoughts. And I think Deepak responded well to that. To be honest, I've never spoken to him. The whole thing like happened kind of like my people to his people, etc. So I don't know, but I think that it's the mindfulness metacognition angle of my book that touched him.
Well, for sure. I mean, it's a great accolade to have, but also in terms of the work that you do, I suppose. So, as a clinical psychologist and as somebody who has a private practice in New York, you work a lot with people when it comes, whether it's relationship issues or stress management, and of course, career coaching, but an anxiety as well is something that I wanted to touch on because we've gone through an interesting time. We've had a global pandemic. We have conflict in the world. We have lots of challenges and we have lots of impacts from things like social media impacting people today. And from your perspective, what's your sort of top level overview when you look at kind of where we find ourselves as humans? Because it's quite a challenging world sometimes for people, and sometimes people need help, advice, assistance to work through some of these challenging, tough times.
Well, I mean, thankfully, I think for the most part, I think that people are getting back to normal at this point, right? I think the pandemic for most people is hopefully in their rear view mirror. And I always say, and it's not just what I say, it's also just a truth in psychology, that the healthy function of anxiety is to stimulate preparation behaviors. And the healthy function of discomfort is to stimulate changes, right? And so I think the positive side of the pandemic, which by the way, I'm not trying to make light of it. I realize, many people lost their lives. And so thankfully for me, I actually didn't experience that part on a personal level. So for me, it was a lot more just about the lifestyle changes that happened as we all had to go into lockdown for an extended period of time and start making big changes. And I think for a lot of people, we got closer to our families. One of the results of hardship is actually that we tend to get closer to our social support networks if we're fortunate enough to have them. And I did have them. And so I got closer to them. However, I have to say, I don't think having a social support network is entirely just due to, quote, fortune. I think it's also something that people work at and build upon. And so I think the pandemic maybe even stimulated some people to realize that they needed to invest more in that. I think the pandemic also stimulated people to realize that maybe they needed to think for themselves sometimes more often, that there were a lot of questions that came up about who to trust and, what narratives to believe, and in ways that people hadn't necessarily exercised their critical thinking muscles as much as we all had to in every way, shape, or form, no matter what side of an issue people ultimately came down on. My hope is that at least everybody at some point, did some deep thinking, did some deep reflection. So I actually think that for those of us who were fortunate enough to be able to make it through the pandemic, we actually came out having built some resiliency skills.
Yeah, and I suppose the book itself, just to go back to the book for a moment, the tagline, I suppose, is about harnessing the power of your anxiety. So when you talk about people actually having to harness the power of anxiety, what exactly does that mean for sort of, everyday people that look?
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon. I love that question because, of course, talking about my book is a really important topic for me, and I chose every word so carefully. So I really appreciate you inviting me to expound on exactly why it's called Nervous Energy: Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. So when people get anxiety, Mother Nature gives us a little zing of energy. That's why, maybe our adrenaline goes up, or we get a racing heart, or sweaty palms, or we feel restless. That's because anxiety is about realizing that maybe there's a threat coming up that we don't necessarily feel that we have all the resources we need to cope with. So our body starts kicking into high gear and our mind starts kicking into high gear. Even our vision literally gets a little bit more narrow, our physical vision, because again, Mother Nature is giving us the gift of increased energy and intense focus in order to fight a stressor. Where a lot of people go wrong is they don't harness it. And so then they just end up with this intense laser beam focus on being anxious about being anxious, or on being self-critical about the fact that they're anxious in a moment, or, telling themselves to just forget about the concern and not be anxious about it, when in fact, it could even really be something that would benefit from some direct attention. And so harnessing the power of your anxiety is about learning how to take a good appraisal of what exactly is the nature of the anxiety. And then there's 9 techniques in the book about different mental ways that you can engage in a constructive, effective, solution-oriented, problem-solving type of way with the anxiety, or with the source of the anxiety.
I love that. Just the words that you've used there in terms of almost viewing it through the lens of it's a gift from Mother Nature, and actually you can harness it. I know that might sound difficult for some people listening or watching us today, but actually it does completely shift the mindset. And as you say, the book goes into these details about, this is how you can actually begin to harness some of that power. So thank you for sharing that. The other thing I wanted to mention while we're talking about writing, I suppose, is that you have write for things like Women's Health magazine, which people definitely will have heard of, and Psychology Today, which is a very, very popular publication. So can you tell me a little bit about the writing that you do there?
Sure, yeah. So I think it's important to share that when I was like 8 years old, I wanted to be an author. I've just always loved to write. I've also always been a rather talkative person. In fact, sometimes I need to learn how to just be quiet more, right? So for me, writing is basically it's easy because it's just taking all the things I want to say and then simply writing them down. So I know, again, for different people, they have, like, I do have certain struggles, like I can't do math to save my life, right? But when it comes to writing and feelings and expressing myself, that part has always been pretty easy. So my 2 books, the way that they came about is a person who is really close to me, who's given me a lot of great career advice, told me that she really thought I should write a book. And I said, well, what would it be about? And she said, well, it would basically just be about what are the techniques that you're always teaching your clients, because it's pretty interesting the way that you just opened up your practice and it grew so big. And like, what are you telling these people, you know? So I said, okay. So I just simply made a list of the 9 techniques that I was tending to teach the most often. And basically thought, okay, well, I'll just write about what the techniques are. And then I was very thankful to work with an amazing editor through Macmillan, my publisher. And what she said is, she said, this will be a lot more interesting if you turn it into a story. So come up with like 3 different like characters, like one person who has kind of like an OCD type personality, and one person who has like a panic type of personality, and then one person who's just like a super worrywart, and then talk about which techniques would be good for them and tell stories about them. And that was a great idea that she gave me. So that's, you know, how that book came about. And then the dating book came about because I was invited by Fox News to talk about what they call dating season in New York, and to provide my tips for the, you know, daters, you know, the singles, you know. And so one of my worst fears is actually running out of like good content when I'm on TV. And so I always over prepare. So I knew I was only going to have 5 minutes, but I came up with 10 tips of my best tips for daters. And after the segment, the host was like, you have such good ideas. You should put those down into a book. And I said, yeah, why not? So I just basically wrote them down and filled them out, and there was the book.
I love that. That's really, really good. And you mentioned, you know, from that Fox News or that Fox appearance, and I know you've been on ABC and CBS and VH1 and lots of the well-known global and national media stations. But that's a great story. So thanks for sharing that with me. The other thing as well, in terms of not just writing, but I know that you're a member of the American Psychological Association and also the National Register of Health Psychologists, and that's really sort of the upper echelon of, you know, psychologists at a very high standard. And to that end, you've kind of worked with entrepreneurs, you've worked with Fortune 500 companies. And can you tell me a little bit about the business side of the work that you do? Because that would definitely be of interest to some of our audience, because although people have challenges and opportunities and things in their own personal life, but when it comes to business, I know you're very involved with the Entrepreneurs Organization, and you have worked with a number of Fortune 500 organizations.
Yeah, definitely. I actually think that's one of the things that I guess kind of makes me different from a lot of other therapists, because I actually even have programs that I teach to other therapists about how to set up a successful therapy business. For some reason, a lot of therapists seem to have the idea that, you know, business is over here and then feelings are over here. And, you know, it's like we have to somehow suffer through the world of business while keeping our feelings and our personal sensibilities intact. And I actually regard it as like different. So I never set out to be an entrepreneur, but I'm just a goal-oriented person. And I've always had to support myself. So making money for me was always actually really an essential. I'm married now, thankfully, and it's a different situation. But as a teenager, I was actually on my own very early. And so I really had to always just get comfortable with the fact that I needed to be making money. And so through that, I started to actually develop a sense of pride and what psychologists call self-efficacy, about being able to support myself. And as a psychologist, obviously we're high on what's called empathy, being able to put yourself in the other person's mind and thinking how they feel. And that's actually a big business skill if you think about it, whether it's about marketing and trying to think about how, you know, you could create ads that will speak the right way to the right customer at the right time, or, you know, you're trying to hire people, and so you're trying to kind of get inside their head and figure out what kind of employee they would be, or whatever the situation may be. So on a personal level, doing well in business was important to me. And then as a psychologist, I actually feel like there's a lot of intuitive connections And so naturally, I just started mixing up and, talking with a lot of business people just out of personal interest. And then I think word kind of spread amongst business people that they could see me and I would help them with their personal issues, but I would also understand how to access the passion within their business issues.
That makes so much sense, because you're right. That word empathy in business is probably more important now than it's ever been. I was actually talking to someone, Helen Yu, recently. She was actually telling me a little bit about her grandmother and what an influence her grandmother had been on her life growing up. And she said, you know what, my grandmother had no sort of formal education. She didn't have the same opportunities that I was afforded, but she instilled in me, that human connection and the empathy of being, a good, open, honest, authentic person. And it is amazing when you think about how in business, it almost feels like there are only some people in business, particularly in large corporations, only starting to really understand how vital that is as a trait, that we understand that we are empathetic, that we are genuine, that we are authentic. And I just think when you were talking there, it reminded me of that conversation with Helen Yu. She was saying, look, my grandmother had no formal education. She would have never been a C-suite executive. But you know what? Given her personality traits and the way she approached life, she would have made a great C-suite executive if she was born in a different era.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a lot of C-suite executives that, have a non-traditional background, maybe some of them who, barely finished high school or, whatever. I personally didn't finish college till I was 29, and I was a high school dropout. So, I just needed to wait until I had the time and the purpose and the goal and the reason to go to school. But yeah, I definitely agree that a lot of what we need in order to succeed in business and in life, some of it can be learned in school, but so much more of it is not necessarily stuff that you learn in a book. Unless it's my book, Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety.
100%. I
Just
like
kidding.
that. And the last thing, because I do want to ask you some other things, but before we move off this topic, I know you've done quite a few online self-help programs as well, which
Mhm.
have sort of extended, I suppose, the geographic reach, because you don't have to be in the place at the same time. But whether that's Japan or Dubai or other areas of the world, across Europe and France, etc. But what has that done for you? How did you go about approaching that?
It's been so amazing. Like you said, I mean, I am so thankful because I'm also a mom to a 6-year-old. So it's extremely important to me to be home as much as I possibly can. So I love, thanks to the digital world, that I can literally just be all over the place, without leaving, and I can be with my home and my family as much as I want to. So I think the way that happened is a lot of it honestly has been inbound. So I'm not necessarily reaching out to a bunch of people. But I think the reason for that is because, in 2011, when I was first starting my practice, I had, just a little WordPress website. And I had a rule for myself that I would work 40 hours a week, either seeing clients, which was my ideal, which I didn't realize at the time that seeing 40 clients a week would burn a person out. I was just, fresh out of graduate school trying to pay my student loans. And so I said, I'll, work 40 hours a week, either seeing clients or figuring out how to get them. And naturally, at first, there was more hours without clients. And so I would, in my website, WordPress, I had learned, how to Google and about SEO and how I could go into like the little footers of every page and, put keywords, and just whatever time I had, I would be working in some way. And I think getting in early, there were not a lot of therapists or psychologists that were doing that. And then I went to this website called Help a Reporter Out. And I would submit like little quotes whenever journalists would ask for them. And I knew how to be brief, which was important to journalists. A lot of therapists will go on and on. And so for whatever reason, the journalists started using my quotes. My website had pretty good SEO. And then I would always follow up with a newsletter to stay on everybody's radar. And I just think it kind of snowballed in a positive way. And now I don't do anything for outreach. It's just all inbound.
Well, that's wonderful, and thanks for giving us that little insight into how that sort of begun. But it began by you maybe thinking a little bit differently, providing things that you could provide, and it, as you say, things sort of snowball from there. Well, look, thanks for all that great information and insight. I'm sure that's going to be fascinating to everybody who's watching and listening to this episode. I do want to
That's so
ask you if
kind of you, Simon. Thank you.
well, no, I really do appreciate it, and I wanted to ask you a couple of other things because we've mentioned your books, and we'd certainly recommend people go out and grab those and read those if they haven't already. But I wanted to ask you about your own learning style. Now, obviously, you have your formal education, and as you say, you had to work through that, etc. But what things do you read? I mean, do you like picking up a physical book and writing notes in the sort of the margins? Do you listen to audiobooks? Are you just watching Netflix at night because you've had enough of reading during the day? How does it work for you? What kind of a learner are you? Are you visual, written, audio, or is it a mixture of all those things?
Definitely a mixture. So I'm left-handed, but I'm holding a pen because I always am writing notes. I'm left-handed, but I'm not bad with my right hand either. So I think I'm kind of, that's one of the reasons I wanted to get a PhD, is because I wanted to be able to, do research, do some writing, do some clinical work, some consulting. I like to kind of pivot around a lot. So I do love to hear things. I think it's an interesting question. I've never thought about it. What kind of learner am I? I actually think it depends on the material. So when I, like learning language, I like to hear things. On the rare occasions when I have to learn math concepts, I need to see things. Writing things is a great way for me to develop thoughts and develop ideas, or to memorize things. I do love to write and, mark up a book and color code it and highlight it and stuff. But I also love audiobooks. All of my books are available in audiobook because I'm really passionate about that. I love to listen to audiobooks, while I sleep or while I walk or whatever. As far as, books that I've, personally been into, I enjoy fiction books if I can get lost in them, though these days, I'm a little bit more into books that are going to solve problems for me. So there's a book called Make Time by Jack Knapp. That's amazing. I think he's like a former Google engineer or something. And so he wrote this book of all kinds of really great hacks about just how to make more time in your day, which as a mom and an entrepreneur and a wife, I really enjoy. And then there's another book called Make Your Bed by he's a Navy SEAL. I can't remember his last name. But yeah, I love books. I always have.
Yeah, I think that's great. And when you say that I like writing notes in the edges of the books, I definitely had that picture of you in terms of the book use. But it's also interesting that your own books are available on Audible and other areas. And was that a conscious decision from the start that I wanted them to be an audio book or not? Yeah.
100%,
Okay.
yes. Because I just think so many people are so busy, and especially my books are actually about, again, self-improvement or solving problems. And so they're kind of marketed to, busy, goal-oriented, results-oriented people, and, people like me, right? So like they might be somebody who's like, well, I want to listen to that book while I'm on the treadmill or, whatever. And I mean, we all enjoy the idea of having, a book that we can just, sit and hold and read and have all day with. But I also, again, actually think that there's a lot to be said sometimes for just hearing something over and over again. So like I'll listen to audiobooks while I'm folding the laundry or, walking across town or whatever I need to do. And even if I'm not paying full attention to it, I'll listen to it again and again. And it's almost like having a positive influence kind of whispering in my ear.
And did you always consider having somebody else read it like a voice actor, or did you even consider reading them yourself? Was that a conscious decision either way?
Well, my audiobook for Dr. Chloe's 10 Commandments of Dating, I did read myself, and I was so thankful. A really good friend of mine from Entrepreneurs Organization got me a connection to do my audiobook myself at the same place that does like Oprah's books and all these places. So it was super amazing. And then Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety, I wanted to read myself, but the publisher decided during the pandemic for sound booth issues or whatever, that they wanted to get an actress instead, a voice actress. And I have to say, she did an incredible job. She and I have even become friends on social media. She really, I can see why she's truly like a professional voice person. I actually felt like I even heard my material in a new way, like hearing her read it. She did an amazing job.
It's amazing to hear you say that, because I talk to quite a number of authors and publishers, and I'm still torn, because sometimes I love to hear it in the person's own voice and to really get the inflection in their voice and hear how they structure certain, the sort of audible word. But sometimes, and I've been told by publishers that sometimes these voice actors can really bring something to life. And there's one author in particular who's an international bestseller. Is always in the top of the crime charts, and actually stopped reading her own books because she found that some of these voice actors could actually portray her stories better. She felt better than she could. And it's a hard thing, because you kind of immediately think you want to read it yourself. But when somebody else does a good job, it's a hard one. I haven't made any decisions, and I like both. But I do like asking that question, because I think anybody who does a book and considers audio, it is a decision you have to make, isn't it?
Yeah, well, one of the things, because I was pushing so hard, I even did a social media campaign like on my publisher to get people to put pressure on them to let me read the book myself. I was like really into that. And so what they did is they were like, we really cannot let you do it yourself, but they put a lot of energy into it. They found 3 or 4 really good options that really captured my voice and my personality. And then they let me choose between them. And again, I have to say, I think it was better, honestly, than if I had done it myself. It really sounds like me, only better. I think they did a great job.
And so I suppose the $1 million question is, for the next book, whenever that is, would you do it yourself, or would you go down that road again?
I would be flexible. I mean,
Yeah.
again, her name was Jordan, was the woman who did my
It's
audiobook
Jordan
on this
Killam.
lesson.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you know who she is.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you know who she is?
I've been a long time Audible listener. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, she's
Yeah.
amazing. Jordan Killam, shout out to you. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
she was amazing. So yeah, I mean, I would always be open to working with Jordan again.
That's great. Well, thank you for that. I want to move that on a little bit as well, because I also want to talk about people in your own life, people that you admire, people that have inspired you. And if you don't want to name people, it might just be a particular character trait or a personality type. But when I ask you about who admires you, who inspires you, what springs to mind?
Well, the first big clear thing that comes to mind is this amazing teacher I had. Honestly, I'm afraid I'll get choked up talking about her. She's so amazing. Her name is Professor Catherine Monk. And as I mentioned, I didn't finish college till I was 29. I was coming in later after having been a high school dropout. And then I ended up at Columbia University. And so I was really, kind of nervous and wondering if I could fit in there. And I knew that my goal, my whole reason for going, was because I wanted to get a PhD in clinical psychology, which I knew was going to be like actually even more competitive probably than even getting into Columbia. And so I was really nervous. And, but I was harnessing the power of my anxiety by sitting in the front row and, really just trying to, do my best. And on the first day of the abnormal behavior class that she was teaching, she was this beautiful, glamorous woman. And there I was like super frumpy, like super, like not that being poor means being frumpy, but in my case it did, because I didn't get my hair done, just nothing. And so like I was feeling just so nervous. And on the first day, this beautiful, glamorous clinical psychologist, she's like, if anybody is interested in being mentored, I really like to mentor students. And it changed the whole feeling for me, because I went from feeling like how can I convince anybody that I belong here, to like her just opening up this incredible invitation. And so I stayed after the class and I was like, do you remember what you said? That would be me. And she really did take me under her wing. I mean, she just helped me every step of the way, before, during, and after the whole process. And she was amazing.
I really like that, because quite often when you think about somebody that helped you in life, and you reflect back, sometimes that person, they didn't have to do that. They didn't have to say that. There was no financial reward in it for them. They just did it to help another human being on their path, on their cause. And I think that's a wonderful story. And that was probably such an important pivotal moment for you, you know, and you kind of needed that at that moment in time. I mean, that's wonderful. I really like that. What about advice, though, Chloe? What about, you know, advice that you've received over the years? Now, this might be back in your childhood. It might be something from last week. But what's the best advice you've received that you think is really important in life? Or is there advice that you often pass on to others that you'd like to share with us today?
Wow, that's an interesting question. So I don't know if this is like a politically correct thing to say at this moment, but I was when I was getting ready to launch a product. This is, many, many years ago. And I was getting ready to launch this product and I was really nervous about it. And I was looking at different costs of different ways to do it. And I talked to this woman who was actually very successful in this area. And I said, I just don't know what to do. Like, maybe I'll start with the small, thing. And she said, you know what, pull out the big guns. And by that, what she meant, and again, different people have different feelings about guns. Like I said, there were no actual guns involved. It was just an expression. And she said, pull out the big guns. And it was a way that I think she was communicating, be bold, go big. Don't play small. Don't be fearful. And I followed her advice, and the situation ended up being successful. And while I also think that on the other hand, there's times and places where entrepreneurs are actually better to start very scrappy and keep their overhead very low. There's also certain times and places where you just have to take the plunge and play big. And so knowing exactly when to do it, when to play big and when to be cautious, I'm sure is an art in and of itself. But for me, learning how to just take a risk, I think has been a really good lesson.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And yeah, it's that go for it. Yeah, think bigger, pull out the big guns, as the saying went. But yeah, I get that. I get that. That's really good advice, because sometimes you need that little bit of a nudge, don't you? That little bit of
Fire in your belly.
confirmation. Yeah, confirmation that you're doing the right thing here. Go for it, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and the other thing I wanted to ask you about is the next sort of 6 to 12 months. Obviously, when I talk to people who are busy and they're in my sweet spot, which are, they're creatives, they're leaders, they're thinkers. You're always thinking about, what's coming down the road. So what's on your roadmap? How do you go about planning? And is there anything you're hoping to achieve over the next 6 to 12 months? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, well, what I've been doing more and more of is actually speaking to larger and larger audiences, which has been a lot of fun. Again, just, being a mom, and having one child, and in likelihood, I'll probably only have one. I'm not as, fortunate as you. I know you have 4 little ones, which is so awesome. In my life, it looks like probably one, and he's a wonderful little boy, and I'm so thankful for him. So that means that the time of cost return on my own time has really changed dramatically. And in a certain way, it's actually been positive. I've been stunned at how much, I can actually command for my time, which is again just important for me as a mom, because the time issue has become big. So I've been speaking to big audiences, and it's been exciting to be able to just connect and touch and interact with thousands of people sometimes, even just in an hour. It's been incredible. And it's a different kind of an energy. I love individual work as well, and I still do some of that through some corporate accounts, but for the most part, I'm doing speaking. And so I've been, targeting more of those opportunities. And then as far as writing, I've actually been doing some Dear Dr. Chloe columns, so Newsweek and Epic Times have tapped me to do some of those. And if anybody wants to hit me on social media with your questions, you can find me on social media. I'm sure Simon will provide a way to do that. And you can at me like with any Dear Dr. Chloe questions. I'm always hungry for those. I may or may not be able to answer everyone, but I really enjoy those. So yeah, and then I've been thinking about books as well, just, different ideas here and there. I'm not going to say too much about it yet because there's different ideas in the hopper.
Well, that sounds like a very exciting next 6 to 12 months. There's a lot happening. And I'm sure you'll be inundated with, dear Dr. Chloe, can you help me with
I
this?
love it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, that almost brings us to the end. And there's only really two things I want to ask you before we wrap up today. And that is, first of all, is there any area that I haven't touched on or anything else that you'd like to share with our worldwide audience today while we're together? And the second thing is, as well as obviously I can put some links to social media, but if people do want to reach out, is the best place social media? Is it the website? Where would you send people to directly?
Yeah. So for people who are listening and may not be able to like necessarily look at links later, they can go to nervousenergybook.com, and nervousenergybook.com will just take you to a page in my website, which will obviously have information about the book. But through the website, you can also navigate to all my social handles and that kind of stuff. And, the best way to connect with me right now is through social media, though there are ways to contact me directly through my website as well for, speaking or other types of things. And as far as, the message that I would want to leave people with, again, I want people to know that there is a healthy function to anxiety, and it is to stimulate preparation behaviors. So that's kind of the point of the Nervous Energy book, but it's also actually the point of the dating book, which is that for people who are, not happy with what's going on in their life, the book is full of ways that they can change it. So the healthy function of anger, for example, is to stimulate boundary setting behaviors. So whatever emotion a person is having, I want them to ask themselves, what could be the constructive reason that Mother Nature is giving me this feeling? I really don't feel like any feeling is, quote, bad. It's more just, what is the feeling stimulating me to do?
Listen, I think that's wonderful. And quite often we forget to ask that question. That's the vital question. What is this actually telling me or asking me to do? And I think that's so important. And obviously, people need to go out and get both books immediately.
I agree.
So thank you so much indeed. That brings us lovely to the end of this episode today with Dr. Chloe Carmichael. Thank you to Chloe. Thank you to everybody who's been watching or listening around the world. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, do all the things I need you to do to help support the podcast. And make sure that you join me back here for more discussions with creatives, leaders, and thinkers. Thank you, Chloe. It's been an absolute pleasure to catch up with you today.
Pleasure's mine, Simon. Thank you.